Welcome back, everyone, to another segment here on GEMS podcast. With me today is a special guest by the name of Mark Graban. And you already know me, Miss Genesis Amaris Kemp, the founder and host of GEMS podcast. But it's not about me, it's about my guest, Mark, today. And let me tell you a little bit about Mark so you could get comfortable with what's coming next. Mark Graban is author of award-winning book Lean Hospitals, Improving Quality, Patient Safety, and Employee Engagement. Mark is also co-author with Joe Swartz of Healthcare Kaizen or Kaizen, engaging frontline Kaizen. Thank you. Engaging frontline staff in suitable continuous improvements and the executive guide to healthcare Kaizen. His most recent book is Measures of Success, React Less, Lead Better, Improve More. He is also the creator and editor of the anthology book, Practicing Lean. He serves as a consultant to organizations through his company, Constancy, Incorporated, and also through the firm Value Capture. He is also a senior advisor to the technology company KaiNexus. He has focused on healthcare improvement since 2005 after starting his career in industry at General Motors, Dell, and Honeywell, some of the big companies you all heard of. Mark is the host of the podcast, including Lean Blog Interviews, My Favorite Mistake, and Habitual Excellence, presented by Value Capture. Mark holds a BS in Industrial Engineering from Northwestern University and an MS in Mechanical Engineering and a MBA from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. That's MIT, y'all. Leaders for Global Operations Program. So man, you are going to be hearing from a subject matter expert today, and we're going to be learning from our mistakes. So without further ado, put your hands together and welcome Mark Graban.
Hi, Genesis. Thanks for having me. Thank you for the introduction.
My pleasure, Mark. And wow, yowza, you have done a lot. So we will have a lot to talk about. So Mark, I definitely want to give the audience a chance to get to know you in a fun and personal way. So there are two options you can choose from. We can break the ice up front or play a rapid fire 10-question game. So what are you in the mood for?
Let's go with rapid fire.
Okie dokie. We're playing rapid fire with Mark and Genesis. Question number 1. If you can recreate or change any significant moment in your life, what would it be and why?
Oh gosh, let's see if I can give a rapid fire answer. That's a pretty heavy question. I'll say when I left my first job at General Motors to go to MIT, all things being equal, maybe I should have stayed on that job 1 year longer at GM. But if I hadn't gone to MIT then and I hadn't taken that job at Dell, I wouldn't have met my wife. So I don't want to change that. So that's a tough one, right? Because I think about were any of these major decisions a mistake? Here's the one I would change. I quit Dell Computer to join a startup after about 20 months. I should have maybe stuck it out at Dell a little bit longer because I ended up having to repay some signing bonus and relocation expenses. I should have been a little more patient.
Okay.
I'll give more rapid answers to the other questions, hopefully.
No worries. Question 2. If you could have lunch or dinner with any person, past or present, who would it be?
Well, I'll pick somebody who might seem obscure to a lot of people, but would be meaningful to me. Dr. W. Edwards Deming. He passed away in 1993, but he's a famed quality guru. I've read his books. I've seen videos of him. Deeply influential. I've never had a chance to meet him, and I wish I could have.
Question 3. Coffee, tea, or what's your drink of choice?
Coffee.
Question 4. If you could go back in time and give younger Mark a piece of
Hmm.
advice, what would it be?
Learn to be more patient without losing the drive to move forward and make things better. Like trying to find that balance. There are times I've gotten in trouble for maybe not being patient enough with others or even with myself.
Question 5. If you could have any superpower, what would it be?
Um, maybe I'd take super strength as long as that didn't make my lower back problems any worse as a result. Is it a superpower to not have middle-aged lower back pain? I'll take that. I aim low now when it comes to superpower.
Question 6. You just came across a windfall of cash. However, to get the remainder of the proceeds released to you, you must contribute to 3 charities of your choice first. So,
Mhm.
what charities are you contributing to?
So for one, I would probably donate to some sort of scholarship fund related to MIT and STEM careers, in particular for girls. Secondly, I would donate to a nonprofit that I'm on the board of. It's called the Louise H. Batts Patient Safety Foundation. And then a third organ, I would donate to the Marine Mammal Care Center near Los Angeles, a place my wife and I have visited. They rescue and take care of and release sea lions and seals and otters and animals like that. It's amazing work that they do, and those animals are super cute.
Amazing. 7. Okay, here's a good one. You and your wife had just won an all expense paid getaway. You may
Mm.
not be able to return back to your home base because the pilots are on strike and not flying back for some time. So, where are you headed?
I would say Japan. I wouldn't mind getting stuck in Japan for a while. There's a lot of places I wouldn't mind getting stuck in, but I've been able to go to Japan for work 5 times. My wife's only been there very briefly as part of a business trip. So I want to go to take her to Japan on vacation mode.
Ooh, super cool. And it's all expense paid.
Yeah.
Question 8. With so many things going on in the world, what makes Mark a wild card factor and remain true to yourself?
I'm willing to take on uphill battles. And sometimes that gets frustrating. Again, this comes back to the question of patience and finding a balance between passion and trying to drive change. But yeah, I haven't given up on taking on uphill battles of different types, and maybe we'll explore that more.
And question 9. So, I want you to think about something crazy that you have done in your life and share that.
Something crazy. Trying to think. I mean, I don't associate myself with doing wild and crazy things.
Or maybe
My
something.
I well my wife's more adventurous that way. She did a tandem skydive jump with the Army Golden Knights, and I stood on the ground kind of anxiously awaiting her safe landing. I trusted the Army Golden Knights. I didn't have the opportunity to go. I'd like to think I would have said yes, and that would have been my wild and crazy thing. But I do admire her ability to do something kind of wild like that.
Super cool. And 10, it's our pass or play question. And here are the rules. If you pass, our roles are reversed and you get to ask me a question. If you choose to play, I ask one last question to wrap up rapid fire. So, do you want to pass or play?
I'll play.
Okie dokie. This is an easy one. Favorite color?
Purple.
Amazing. And thank you for playing Rapid Fire with Genesis, Mark. So, audience,
Sure
I
thing.
hope I hope you got to learn a little bit more about Mark and his fun side. Now we're going to dive into the work that he's doing. So he has a show called My Favorite Mistakes, and he's helping people learn from their mistakes without feeling guilty, having that remorse or shame. Because if we never learn from our mistakes, can we truly say that we're growing, right?
Mhm, mhm.
So, Mark, what prompted you to launching your show, My Favorite Mistakes?
Yeah, well, and that's a really great summary that you gave, Genesis, and and thank you for our first connection was you being a guest on My Favorite Mistake. There's a couple things that sort of came together that led to the launch of the podcast. The first episodes were released September 2020. We'll call it. You mentioned earlier in the intro that I've done other podcasts. I started my first podcast kind of with a clunky name. Probably a mistake, but I'm stuck with the name. The Lean Blog Interviews podcast. It was an offshoot of my blog. I started doing interviews. I don't know. The name is what it is. But I started that podcast in 2006, and I've done almost 450 episodes in that podcast series. So it's probably been on average every 2 weeks for 16 years. When you've had a podcast for a while, you start getting pitches from PR firms or podcast guest bookers who say, well, so-and-so would like to be a guest on your podcast. And because my older podcast was pretty niche, like people who are interested in things like Toyota and what we call lean manufacturing and healthcare improvement and lean startups and related things, it's pretty niche. And a lot of times I would have to say, well, no, I'm sorry. The person you've proposed sounds like a great guest. I would love to interview them, but it just doesn't fit in this podcast. And so I got kind of tired of saying no to interesting people. And in, that first summer of the pandemic, I was working from home. I was looking for some new things to keep myself occupied. And one of these guest PR people proposed Kevin Harrington, who was one of the sharks on season 1 of Shark Tank. And I really started thinking, like, I've got to find a way to say yes. And I think maybe that's a life lesson there, right? It's a mistake to just say no instead of trying to figure out a way to say yes. So I was trying to figure out what kind of format for a broader show would allow me to say yes. So then, the idea of learning from mistakes is something I've been fascinated with for a while. That book, Practicing Lean, that I wrote with 15 other authors, that's really all about reflecting on mistakes that we made in early years of our career for the sake of learning and kind of demonstrating to others, hey, people you might view as accomplished, everybody makes mistakes, and to admit that and to acknowledge that. So that idea was in my head, and so I asked the PR people, "What do you think of an idea, a show about mistakes?" And I love the Sheryl Crow song "My Favorite Mistake," and so that's where I think that's a better title than my Lean Blog Interviews podcast. So those things kind of all came together, and Kevin Harrington thankfully said, "Yeah, I'd love to talk about a mistake," and he came on and told a great story about a mistake he made. He's the inventor of the 30-minute infomercial, basically. And he shared a mistake that kind of, early on in his career, completely cut off his cash flow and could have put himself and his company out of business. And I appreciate and I so greatly admire when somebody that successful is willing to share a story of a mistake they made, not blaming others, but recognizing the mistake and their part in it, and sharing what they did to learn and adjust moving forward. So I think, one of the key themes, with the podcast is, we all make mistakes. It's better if we learn from those mistakes and avoid repeating those mistakes. And Kevin Harrington was gracious enough to be the first to share his story.
That is amazing. And I love the fact that you said, I got to think of a way to say yes and make it work. And you thought about something that was so practical because we all make mistakes, whether we want to, own up to our mistakes or not. But it's our mistakes which come from, the mess that we endure. But it's the mess that curates our message for us to put out into the world to help other
Mhm.
people. And I love the fact that Kevin Harrington came on and shared, because then people could see it from his perspective. Even though he was successful, he does make mistakes, because there are a
Mhm.
ton of successful people that never get out in the open and talk about their mistakes. So people see them one way on the platform and they put
Mhm.
them on a pedestal, but they have to realize that they've had those start ugly moments.
Mhm.
They've had failures. They've had moments where they had to go without paying themselves. They've
Mhm.
had moments where, they may have lost a crap ton of money and they
Mhm.
had to start all the way over. So we're gonna go back and forth here. So now that we know about Kevin Harrington and we know a little background into My Favorite Mistake podcast, I want you to share one of your favorite mistakes and how has it helped you personally as well as
Mhm.
professionally.
So, I think back to um, kind of the early years of my career. This was back when I was still working for manufacturing companies. So I was working at Honeywell, and even though I had experience with these lean manufacturing approaches, starting with my time in the automotive industry, but coming into Honeywell, they had a training and certification program that they still wanted me to go through, and I'm not the type who would turn that down. Well, I couldn't turn it down, but I happily accepted that opportunity because there's always something to learn. I think that growth mindset is an important thing to have. So I was going through this education and this program and sort of deepening my understanding on some of these methodologies, and I had to do a certification project as part of this. And well, I think the mistake I made was not fully engaging the frontline production team members in the project that I was assigned to do. So, I created and there's great lesson to be learned from this. I think I created a technical solution that was technically correct, and it would have been helpful, and it would have solved a meaningful business problem, but nobody used it. Nobody used what I had created, and I take some ownership of, or there was that lesson learned of having the right technical solution is never enough. You have to help people accept change. I'm not blaming people for not accepting my change, because the problem was it was very much my change, not our change, or not their change that I was coaching them through. And I say I take some ownership of that. I mean, some of what I was battling against, I think, was the culture of the organization. It was not a culture that it was a culture that encouraged individual efforts, specialists, experts, technical people. It wasn't a culture where I would have been allowed to shut down production for a day to work with the team and have them be involved. So I was swimming uphill against that culture. Maybe I should have fought harder to say, hey, this isn't going to be worth my time or anybody's time if we don't more fully engage and involve the team members. But I think part of my takeaway from that was trying not to be in a position like that, not putting myself in a position like that again. And working as a consultant, I have, the ability, if somebody's asking me to come in and do change to somebody, I'm gonna say no to that. I want to work with people, and I think that was part of my progression. Even though I knew I had that sting in the back of my neck that said, you've got to be engaging people. This isn't really going to, it's not going to be accepted. This change isn't going to be sustainable. When I talk about uphill battles, maybe I should have fought that one harder. But it was definitely a lesson that I've carried forward in my career. I do not want to put myself in that position again. And now, I think of work that I'm doing right now. It involves working with clients where we are engaging the people who do the work, and that leads to not just better solutions, but solutions that are much more likely to be accepted and to last.
That is amazing. And one thing that stood out as you were sharing that story, Mark, and me being able to resonate with Honeywell, because it's kind of similar to one of the oil and gas companies that I worked with, because they could be very conservative when it comes to risk management and risk
Hmm.
aversion. So it was like, I would say you have to partner the MOC, which is management of change,
Hmm.
with COC, which is culture of change. And the
Hmm.
two have to come together in order for synergies to really take place and then really build out that COE, which is that center of expertise, or some people
Hmm.
say center of excellence, in order to make sure that everyone feels seen and heard and they have the buy in to want to do the work. Because if I came up with the idea and I said this would be really good, but the people who are out running the unit in the chemical plant don't see the vision, they're not going to want to do it, because one thing
Right.
that you never want to do is shut down a chemical plant, because that's $1 million a day that's out the door. And when I, this young whippersnapper, when I got in there, I was like, hey, why don't we do this? And one lady told me, are you crazy? Do you think that it's wise to shut down a chemical plant? We have so many products and grade wheels that we're running. So then that's whenever I was like, oh, well, if they would just do the MOC plus the COC, then we could really have a COE. But it takes everyone coming together, and until someone sees your vision, they're not going to want to jump
Right.
on the bandwagon, because they're like, what's in it for me to make this change whenever we've already been doing this? But the way you're
Hmm.
doing something may not be, effective or efficient, because times have changed and there's new
Right.
technology where you could do something quicker, and then you could begin to outsource that and work on your own zone of genius.
Yeah. Well, in the environment I was in was, parts assembly, right? So that's much easier to shut down than a chemical process would be. It's much easier to start back up than a chemical process would be. We could have built up inventory to then allow us to shut down for 4 hours or for 8 hours. We could have absorbed that, but it's just it wasn't the culture. I would get told, hey, this is your certification, this is your project, you need to go do it. And so I'm like, well, I got certified, I have a plaque on the wall, but it should have, I wish it would have driven more improvement and change for the business. Some of that's on me, some of that was, I think, the culture and the management of that company at that time, and that was almost 20 years ago, so maybe things have changed.
Wow. And it's so important too that you said some of it was on you and some of it was on the culture at that time, because whenever we make mistakes, we have to take ownership of our mistakes and don't be in
Mhm.
denial, because that is
Mhm.
also going to help us grow. But sometimes when people face mistakes, they want to point the fingers and look at other people,
Right.
whenever it may not necessarily be someone else's fault. It could be a joint effort. So take
Mhm.
ownership of what went wrong and just learn from it, so you don't have to rinse and repeat when it comes to that mistake. So when you think
Right.
about the success of your podcast and you hear all these different stories of mistakes, is there one story that stood out to you where you learned from their mistakes? Because we can very well learn from other people's mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to learn from different guests. I mean, I think there's value in like learning from the specific mistake. But let's say a guest who had a chiropractic business where their first attempt failed because of some marketing challenges or marketing mistakes or leadership mistakes, and then they learned from that and were successful the second time. Like I'm never going to go open a chiropractic practice. I need to be going to one more often as a patient because of the back problems maybe. But I think the one high level takeaway I hope people get from it is the value in talking about mistakes, the value that comes from that, like reflecting as individuals, that can lead to professional growth. And but I think it's even more powerful than when as leaders we create that culture that makes it safe for people to talk about mistakes. So I think one of the lessons, so here's a more direct answer to your question. The lesson that comes from CEOs or other senior leaders who say they lead by example. When they share their mistakes with their employees, that's powerful. That doesn't give people carte blanche to go do whatever they want, right? Without ever having any repercussions. But when there's an honest mistake where we thought we were making a good decision, and then we learn something and it turns out, oh, okay, if we could go back in time, we would have decided differently. That's a mistake. That's not worth punishing anybody over, because all that does is drive people to hide mistakes. And then we can't learn and grow as individuals or organizations. So, I think there's two pieces. Like, one is like people who demonstrate the strength and the humility to be willing to share a mistake, their ability to learn from that mistake, and then like their ability to create a culture, because it's going to move an organization forward when we're able to be open about mistakes, so we can talk about them, we can diagnose what happened, what we've learned from it, and what we would do differently moving forward. Those are, I think, the main things that are reinforced with me. And I hope my listeners come to share that view or have that view strengthened.
And I could really respect that sentiment, because I think organizations that celebrate mistakes and say, oh, sorry that that happened to you, but what do you think that you could have done to prevent this from happening? Is there anything that your colleagues could have done or we could have done as an organization? And they celebrate that mistake, which means that individual doesn't feel bad about making the mistake. And to your point, they will come forward next time a mistake is made, and they will have that full ownership. And then we will debrief together to see what could have been done to mitigate that from happening. Because maybe it's something in the process that needs to be changed. Maybe it's something that we didn't fully do in the onboarding when that individual came into the organization or the team, that we need to look at because things have changed, or et cetera. So just make it a conversation and make it like a 360 feedback, where that individual is giving feedback, but then they're also getting feedback in a non-judgmental way, but in a way where they're able to really thrive. And then Mark, are there any other tips or tricks that you want to share that I may not have asked, or you think would add value to this before we jump into the call to action?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's a need for balance, right? So we want to reflect about mistakes without dwelling on them. A couple of my guests have made that point really well. There's a certain point where you need to put it behind you. But, I think one definition of a favorite mistake is that whether we want to or not, we remember it. It sticks with us. And hopefully it drives us in some positive way. Like, the point is not to beat ourselves up or to feel bad about it forever, but to, maybe be inspired and remember the lessons so we can avoid repeating it. And I think there's also a need for balance. Like, we can celebrate, that's an interesting word. We can honor the mistake, right? Because mistakes are going to happen. Like, that's I think something on one level we have to accept. It might not be great that the mistake happened, but what's worse is not learning from the mistake, right? So when companies go into punishment mode, if you could just fire all the mistake-prone people, well, that life's not that simple. There's a balance, though, between reacting to mistakes and learning from them and improving processes and systems, like you said, Genesis. There's also a time to be proactive and to anticipate what mistakes could be made. And instead of just asking people to be superheroes, so maybe this would have been a better answer to your superhero question. My superpower would have been, I never make mistakes. I don't know if that's a fun comic book or a fun Marvel movie. But we have to be proactive. And this is where I think, as an engineer, you're taught to think through what could go wrong, and don't just tell people, okay, well, there's a risk that you might give this wrong medication to a patient, so don't do that. Like, that's not going to be effective. We need to use lessons that come from Toyota and the lean manufacturing methodology, we would refer to as mistake proofing. How do we have a good process where it's literally impossible to give the wrong patient the wrong medicine? That's more effective than telling people to be careful and then punishing them when sort of the predictable, expected bad thing finally happens in a poorly designed or a poorly managed system. So trying to find balance. And maybe that's a lesson that comes from, other fields or other disciplines. We don't want to have an extreme view one way or another. Let's not a final thought on this. When we talk about human error, like sometimes I get frustrated when people will say the root cause of some sort of problem was human error, and they throw their hands up and say, well, what can you do? People are imperfect. People are going to make mistakes. I'm like, well, yes, that's true. But what we can do about it is not hiring perfect people. What we can do about it is, as you said in asking this question, what we can do is error proof. We can improve systems, we can improve training, we can improve supervision, we can improve systems so that errors are either impossible or far less likely to occur. Because if we just throw up our hands and say, well, human error, well, then we're doomed to have that error repeated if that's our response.
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing that, Mark. And now let's jump into the call to action as we wind down. So what is your call to action today for our audience?
Well, one would be if people are interested in the podcast, they can search whatever podcast app or service that they're listening here. They can go and search for My Favorite Mistake Podcast, or they can go on the web, myfavoritemistakepodcast.com. So I hope people continue listening to Genesis and the GEMS podcast, and maybe you can also listen to My Favorite Mistake.
Amazing. And one thing I want to say, if I could, be on the lookout because Mark has an amazing book that will be hitting the market soon and some other things he's working on in the back end. So I don't know if you want to plug that too, Mark.
Well, it's a very early preview plug. I hope it's going to be an amazing book. That is my goal. Writing a book with the lessons from, I've interviewed at this point, I think about 180 people with their stories and pulling together common themes and lessons learned for people. So I'm working on that book. That'll probably, take me through the rest of this year. So I'm thinking it should be available early 2023. And I don't know what I'll call the book yet. Like I think My Favorite Mistake has been a good name for the podcast. I'm still trying to figure out what to call the book, and I've just barely started the writing. But I'm committed to that project. So talking about it publicly is one way of strengthening my commitment to keep going.
Amazing. And then Mark, I know you already plugged your website, but are there any social media platforms that you hang out on primarily that you want to share?
Probably the most important is LinkedIn. So if people want to just search my name, Mark Graban, on LinkedIn. That's probably the best. To me, that's the professional social network of choice these days. And that's changed a lot, right? LinkedIn has become less of a resume website and more of also being a social network. So I would say, come find me there.
Amazing. And all of Mark's contact information will be in the show notes, y'all. So scroll on down, read, and tap in with Mark. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the podcast. We're on 40+ platforms. And I also want to thank each one of you for tuning in on a regular basis to support the guests that I bring into the GEMS ecosystem, as well as myself. Because of you, we're now ranked in the top 2% globally out of 2.8 million podcasts per www.listennotes.com. So thank each one of you. And if you're interested in becoming a brand sponsor, you can find out more info by heading on over to genesisamarisKemp.net or sending me an email at genesisamarisKemp@gmail.com. So until the next guest, next episode, peace, love, and lots of blessings. Have yourself an amazing day.